What's happening, everyone? Welcome back. And if it's your first time here, just plain welcome. So, I spent the past weekend at the NRA annual meeting in Atlanta, Georgia, just a few hours away, and how could I not? And it gave me an opportunity to talk to a lot of people. I gave a couple of interviews, I've made a couple of interviews, including the one I want to share with you today. This is one I have wanted to have for quite some time. So, I'm going to air that here in a minute. I am So with that out of the way, we're going to get to the interview. This interview and the next one were both kind of experiments in style of how to say shoot this. I was not very prepared to hold how to shoot these interviews. It's not something I'd really done much of. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me a little bit. And with no more ado. Okay, so joining me today is Ryan Petty. Ryan lost his daughter Elena at Parkland. And that's actually a strange bond we have because I lost a friend of mine at the Cafe Racer shooting in Seattle, and it's unfortunately too common. So that there are people who've been touched by this stuff. But I've never really had a chance to talk to somebody who's experienced that to get think the way things went afterwards.
Sure.
Especially from a Second Amendment perspective, the grief is obvious. I'm not going to delve into that, but I know after I lost Kim, for about a few seconds, I was like, have I been wrong about guns?
Yeah. Right.
Is that something you experienced?
Yeah, it is, Tom. Thanks for having me. First of all, it's great to, we've been colleagues for a little while, writing at Bearing Arms,
Absolutely.
and to get a chance to meet you personally and have this conversation. I've been looking forward to this all week. So
Same here.
Yeah.
This was the one interview I wanted to do most.
Awesome. I absolutely had those thoughts. One of the favorite activities my daughter and I, Elena, did together was to go shooting, and she loved it. And I think, not to enrage the other side or anything, but one of her favorite guns was the AR-15. It was easy for her to shoot. Now it was heavy and whatever, so had to help her a little bit.
Yeah.
But she liked it, and it wasn't a big scary gun.
No.
For her. And my kids had grown up that way. I had grown up that way. I grew up in Nevada. We had firearms at home. It was just a normal thing. I remember growing, in high school, going out during high school breaks, and my friend would get a new shotgun or something to go hunting, and it was in his truck.
Mm-hmm.
And he'd say, my dad got me this or whatever, and it was just kind of a normal thing. It wasn't a big deal. No one would have ever thought of bringing that gun into a school, at that time and
Right.
sort of shooting it up. So, always grown up being a strong supporter and believer in the Second Amendment. That was instilled by my father. When Elena was killed, I thought, wow, could maybe I have been wrong about this? Are there things that we could do that would protect her better? And I've been very open about this part of it. Part of the Parkland school safety bill, there was some gun control in there. And I had misgivings about it. I did that soul searching after, and I thought, have I been wrong? The more I learned about it, I sat on a commission that we investigated the tragedy. It was we had public meetings, we had private meetings. We went into every detail of the killer's past, the role the school district played or didn't play, law enforcement, mental health. We went into all the various subjects and did an in-depth investigation. The more we investigated, the less it became for me about the gun.
Right. Because he was a very, very troubled individual.
Absolutely.
Who should have not been able to buy one in the first place under existing law.
It was failure of government.
Mm-hmm.
Parkland is another example of the failure of government to do the job we elect them,
mm-hmm.
and as taxpayers pay them to do. Let me explain. So, this kid, to your point, was troubled. He attacked another student for the first time in kindergarten. He was well known to the school district. In fact, in middle school, they were searching his backpack on a regular basis, and frisking him.
So they knew
he was a threat. And unfortunately, the policies at the time were aligned with some Obama era mandates on schools to remove the quote unquote disparities in discipline between white students and minority students. So in an effort to do that, the school board in Broward County brought in a new superintendent named Robert Runcie. Robert Runcie built a program called the Promise Program. Now, let's be honest, this was not a program. It was a community relations campaign and a couple of PowerPoints. And what he said he would do was get discipline right for minority students. That's really what he said he was going to do. The practical application of that was he and the sheriff signed an agreement. Basically, they just stopped arresting juveniles for committing crimes in Broward County. And the school district was sort of put in charge of not only discipline, which we all understand our school districts have a role in disciplining, maintaining order in the class.
So
but they were sort of a quasi law enforcement agency. They were determining whether or not a juvenile had committed a crime on campus, which is just crazy.
Yeah.
And as their metrics are based on every principal wants to have a good school, good academics and good disciplinary. They literally just swept the issues under the rug. And the Promise Program was purpose built to sweep problems under the rug. So that was failure number one. The school district putting them in charge of quote unquote law enforcement and juvenile justice issues and sweeping issues under the rug. That was number one. Number two, the other issue was just the sheriff stopped arresting juveniles for committing crimes out in the community. And then they refused to cooperate with each other or share information. So if a juvenile was violent at school, which the killer was, if a juvenile was violent out in the community, which he was, the killer attacked his mother several times. He was killing neighborhood animals, and the sheriff's office.
All the classic warning signs.
All the warning signs. They were not sharing information that I think would have made a difference. So if the school district had shared information with law enforcement had shared information with the school district, and the third component I mentioned was mental health. The mental health provider in that community was making almost daily visits to that home because of his violent outbursts. When his mother had lost control of him after his father died, mom just literally lost control. So they were there. If those three had communicated, those three government entities, and shared information, I'd like to believe my daughter would be alive. Why is that? Because if I think what law enforcement needed to make an arrest and to charge him with crime was to know that he was more violent than they knew, and he was also being violent at school. Law enforcement went out there 42 times to his home that we tracked 42 times. Mom begged every single time not to arrest him, not to put anything on his juvenile record. If he had been charged, now particularly when he got older, 17 and 18, if he had been charged with a crime, the gun control folks scream about background checks, right?
Right.
Background checks are only as good. They're only as good as the information in the system.
Exactly.
Because mom begged law enforcement not to do it because they didn't know that the mental health provider was out there because of his violent outbursts, and they didn't know he was violent at school.
Yeah.
They didn't make an arrest. He wasn't charged with anything, so therefore when he went to purchase a gun, he had nothing on his background check. So that, again, failure of government, right?
Yeah.
So
and that was with the mom. That's domestic violence. That's a prohibiting offense, even at a misdemeanor.
Absolutely. It's absolutely inexcusable that he was not arrested for domestic violence. He should have been on a number of occasions. And so, as much as they scream about universal background checks and all this other stuff that they claim, they want to ban this, ban that, raise the age, red flag laws, all this stuff. Any of those solutions are only as good as the information that's given to government, and only if they act on it. And they didn't even act with what they had, which should have been disqualifying for him buying a firearm in the first place. Now, at the end of the day, would that have worked? I don't know. Mom placated him constantly. So if he had been prohibited, I think mom would have done a straw purchase, what we call a straw purchase, which she would have bought the gun for him and let him have it. And so Parkland might have happened anyway. So None of that gun control regime would have done anything about it. What would have helped was there was one time that the district took his threat seriously and they moved him into an alternative school where he had more strict discipline, he had more supervision, and he was forced to deal with or to accept and deal with the consequences of his actions. And I will tell you, Tom, at that point, he began to, I almost hesitate to use the word thrive, but that was the way it was described to us on the commission. He began to behave in school. He began to get better grades. He was on a path to perhaps
being a productive member of society.
Could have been, but he was certainly on a different path than the one he took. But here's where the federal failure comes in. The federal government has directed that we get these students into the least restrictive environment. That's the language that the Department of Education calls it. And that means school districts are compelled to move that child back into a regular classroom as quickly as possible. So once you start doing well in the alternative school, with the better discipline, the stricter consequences, more adult supervision, once you start doing well, the inertia moves you back into that other classroom, and that other classroom was not good for him, and it certainly wasn't good for the 17 that he killed on February 14, 2018.
Yeah, I get the idea of the least restrictive, but when you've got a kid who's gone this long with these kind of problems, you put him in an environment where he suddenly is no longer acting out in that manner.
Right.
It just kind of makes sense to leave him there,
Yes.
maybe, or if you're going to bring them back into a less restrictive environment, maybe titrate that restriction a little bit to see where the threshold is.
Right.
And if you can, if it turns out the problem's solved, great.
Yep.
If not,
Yep.
You don't get those headlines.
100%. No, if you can bring him back into that environment, into the least restrictive environment, he can thrive again. Cool. Maybe that requires a teacher's aide to come in that classroom and deal with him specifically for a period of time, or whatever it is. But the problem with that least restrictive environment, and I'm getting way off the Second Amendment and getting into education, which is another area that I'm involved in, is that when there's a student that's disruptive in a classroom, the other 99% of those students in that class, they lose out on their opportunity to learn whatever it is that teacher was going to teach them that day.
Yeah.
And of course, it's frustrating for the educators that are in the classroom too, because they love to teach and they want to, they work hard and they want to get those lessons taught to those kids. And when they can't do that because somebody's being disruptive, then it throws that whole thing off. So there's a lot of educational reform that needs to happen. I'm glad to see this administration is taking a different approach than we have over the past 100 years.
Yeah.
Since we've been doing sort of the factory model of education.
Yes.
But to come back to the Second Amendment, when you look at the totality of what happened and why it happened, again, it was government's failure to protect our students. And so the solution to that is not gun control. It wasn't to penalize law-abiding gun owners. The solution to Parkland and these other shootings is to protect our schools. This notion of gun-free zones is ludicrous, right? Because killers don't care what your sticker says on the fence or the sign on the fence. They don't care. They're going in to do their deed. So you've got to secure the schools. Some like to call it harden the schools. And what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, he walked through an unlocked gate. He walked into an unlocked door on a building. So the first thing we got to do is secure the perimeter of the schools, right? Know who's on the property. They need to have explicit permission to be on there. We do things like single point of entry in our schools in Florida now. So there's one way in, one way out, unless it's dismissal time and then gates are opened but they're staffed with security personnel, so it's safe. We do that. We lock doors and we put armed guardians and school resource officers in our schools as both a deterrent, which in fact they are, but also, Tom, it should the worst happen for some reason, they're there to end the threat as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And the Guardian program has just been a tremendous success in Florida. It was the gun control folks went crazy when we said, you're going to arm teachers and all this.
Yeah.
Well, We did arm some teachers. We armed security staff also. There are many firearms on that campus now in the state of Florida. You don't know who's carrying, except for that school resource officer. But I can tell you those teachers, I've been through the Guardian program with several of them. They qualify with their firearms at a higher proficiency level than law enforcement has to.
Yeah.
They're good. They're good, and they're going to run to that danger, and they're going to end that threat quickly. And that, I believe, has prevented a number of threats to our schools in Florida.
Absolutely. And, when people, school resource officers are great, but there was a school resource officer at Parkland that day.
Right.
And he did not.
Correct.
I've wrote a lot criticizing him, and I regret none of it.
Yeah.
Because I don't know how he can live with himself personally. I don't know.
Yeah.
A while back, I had a chance to meet Stephen Williford from Sutherland Springs.
Okay. Yep.
And his response, he was like, what he thought about was, how am I going to feel tomorrow?
Right. Right.
How are you going to feel the next day and the next week, knowing you might have, you might go down.
Right.
If it's just me, I'd much rather go down knowing a couple of kids got out.
Right.
While the bad guy was dealing with me, he's not shooting at other people.
Right. That's right.
And the truth of the matter is, most mass shooters are cowards.
Correct.
The moment they meet armed resistance, a lot of them end it themselves at that moment.
They do. They lay down their arms, they kill themselves, they attempt to flee. That's the pattern almost 100% of the time. So you're absolutely right. About the OODA loop and all this stuff, right? These kids do a lot of planning. These shooters, these attackers, they're not all kids. They do some extensive planning, but any disruption to that plan is enough to get them to lay down their arms and stop the killing, right?
These attacks are well planned. They're not well trained.
Correct.
And so they do not know how to deal with the hiccups.
That's correct. 100%. So in the case of Parkland, right, he set up a sniper post in the teacher's lounge on the 3rd floor, and he was going to pick off kids that were fleeing the buildings. Well, we have hurricane windows in the buildings in South Florida, and when he tried to shoot, his bullets were just fragmenting as he was shooting out the window. So he realized that wasn't going to be, his plan wasn't going the way he thought it would. So he stopped, put his guns down, took his vest off and all that stuff, and walked out with the other students. So that's a perfect example right there of his plan getting frustrated.
And that wasn't even a security measure. It's Florida.
Right. It's Florida.
Hurricanes are a thing. I'm in South Georgia.
Yeah.
We get them.
Yeah.
Not quite like y'all do.
Yeah.
That's why Hurricane Michael hammered us so hard. Is we weren't used to Cat 3s. You guys are.
We are.
But that was, what I'd like to say, it's not a security feature. It was just something he didn't account for.
Correct.
And he didn't know how to adjust. These kids, like I say, they're not trained, thankfully. Thank God.
That's right.
We do not want to train them.
Right.
But they don't. If you can disrupt it, you can end it.
You can end it. And so what was so bad about Deputy Peterson's response that day was that, and it's pretty clear to me and others, and certainly what we saw in the commission is that he knew where the shooting was coming from. He knew it was a shooting. He blamed it on fireworks. He didn't know where the shooter was coming from. We know he was lying because he stood behind a cement pillar for 48 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Even while his brethren, his fellow police officers were entering the building to try in an attempt to stop the shooting and to render aid, he stood behind that pillar. Now, if you don't know where the shots are coming from, how do you know which side of the pillar to stand behind?
Right.
So we know he's lying. But there again, another failure of government. Here's the failure there, right? Broward Sheriff's Office had the wrong active shooter policy. They had the post, you may enter. They didn't do what is best practice for law enforcement after Columbine, which is single officer enters and you try to disrupt that attack.
Like Nashville.
We know it works.
Like Nashville.
Correct.
Nashville is a perfect example of how the police respond, because Nashville came after Uvalde, which was another case of officers not going in like they're supposed to.
Correct.
This is standard procedure throughout the country like you said, after Columbine.
That's right.
Columbine, they held firm because they treated these as hostage situations because that's usually what it was.
Right.
And then it was like, oh no, now they're not. Now you go in, and they
Right.
didn't there.
That's right.
And that was another school that had open doors, open fences.
Right.
They had no single point of entry. The bad guy just walked in. This wasn't a planned attack.
Right.
But that almost makes it worse. I mean, he didn't have to, they were so wide open, he could just waltz in on a whim, basically.
It was horrific, especially after what we had seen, in Texas, right after Parkland, right? I mean, to see what happened in Uvalde was just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And I've been to that school. It literally breaks your heart. We went to, my wife and I traveled out there. We went to the memorial just to try to see some of the families and just to be out there. And it's just horrific to think that how bad the response was. Again, another failure of government to protect and do their duty.
Yeah.
So in the case in Parkland, right, it was the wrong active shooter policy. There was little to no training. There was only 5 practice training guns in the entire Broward Sheriff's Office. Now, this is the second largest county in the state of Florida. They didn't even have their own firearms training facility. They were using a county park, which is where the SWAT team was that day. They were at the county park that you and I would go to. That's where they train, right? In full view of the public, whatever. They didn't even have their own training facility. They had 5 blue guns for training purposes. That's all they had. Department, I mean, thousands of deputies, and this is the deputy Peterson couldn't even remember the last time he had active shooter training. We found out it was in 2016, so it had only been a couple of years, but he couldn't remember it. So it was probably one of those point and click things you do for training on, check the boxes and listen to the video and that kind of thing. So he didn't even remember it. And then that sheriff, again, the other failure there in leadership is Parkland was considered a place where you go to kind of retire. Like when you get towards the end of your career, you put those deputies in Parkland because nothing bad happens in Parkland, right? And so he was kind of what was known as retired on duty. So that was sort of when you consider wrong policy, lack of training, and this was after the Fort Lauderdale airport shooting, that nothing changed at the Broward Sheriff's Office after that. So they didn't learn any lessons from that. So that's why I say, back to the Second Amendment, there was nothing that you could do to law-abiding gun owners that would prevent this school attack or other school attacks. That's not the issue here. Are there things that we should do as gun owners? Yeah. I mean, we look at what happened at FSU last week, right? You got to keep your firearms secured, right?
Yeah.
From kids, from minors. There are things we can do as parents. Now, I'm not here to tell anybody how to store their guns. That's up to you. But it's sort of that moral question you asked about, if I'm going to go out, do I want to go out doing the right thing or not? Well, as parents, I think we got to wake up in the morning and say, hey, what's the right thing? Where are my firearms? Are they secured? Do I know and can I control who has access to my firearms? I think we do that as responsible gun owners. Yeah. How you do that, that's up to you. I'm not here to tell you how to do that. That's up to you. Yeah. But we have to do that because we know a lot of these attackers get guns from the home in one way or another. So we have to figure that out. But things like raising the age, things like red flag laws, they have not prevented school shootings.
Well, they didn't prevent FSU.
They didn't prevent FSU. We in Florida are not protecting our universities the way we protect our K through 12 schools. We've got to do a better job there. And I think things like, because the university is different than a K-12 situation. Right. We've got adults that are attending university. There is no reason they should be precluded from carrying a firearm to defend themselves on campus. So we need reform like campus carry in our universities in Florida.
Absolutely.
To prevent them from being looked at as soft targets or easy targets.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, that's about all the time we've got, but thank you so much. I'm definitely going to want to talk to you again in the future because this was great. You've got a perspective most people don't have. It's like I've got a taste of it. Nothing compared to what you dealt with. And the fact that you're still a strong Second Amendment supporter is a testimony, to the fact that a tragedy can happen, but everyone gets, there's a lot to learn.
Absolutely.
And it's not always, the only answer is to take the guns.
That's right.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's great finally meeting you face to face.
Yeah, good to talk.
I appreciate it. All right, I want to thank Ryan again for sitting down with me. Again, this is something I wanted to talk about with him for quite some time. That is a bond we share. It's not a club anyone wants to be part of. What he dealt with obviously is much greater than what I dealt with, but Ryan's just an amazing guy. I thoroughly enjoyed speaking with him, and you know, I look forward to doing it again because he's a great guy. So with that, I am going to start trying to wrap this one up. If you like the video, do me a favor, hit the like button, hit subscribe, notification bell, all that stuff. If you want to help the channel out, help the channel grow, there's a coffee link down below. I would appreciate anything you choose to do. Tilting at Windmills is the name of my Substack, which is also linked down below along with my X profile. So on that note, I'm going to wrap it up, and I will see you all in the next video.